Well, good morning from Sacramento, and thanks to so many of you who are joining from all over the world. It's really exciting to see so many familiar faces. So, thanks for spending part of your morning with us and your afternoon and evening with us. Unfortunately, we find ourselves continuing to do these updates to our clients and partners via Zoom and webinar instead of being in person. So we hope that will change soon, and we certainly hope that everybody is healthy and making the best of the continuing pandemic. Wanted to spend a little bit of time with you all today and just sort of update you quickly on what we have learned from the initial early action, early decision round from this past fall. And I don't think it'll be that surprising to most of you. But we saw more applications than ever before. In certain specific instances, we saw campuses that didn't receive as many applications or were slightly down. But on the trend, we saw more high school seniors applying to four-year universities across the board, and most of that being fueled by technology allowing students to better and more efficiently apply across a wider spectrum of schools. Test optional, certainly helping to fuel part of that growth. Students who didn't necessarily think about applying to four-year universities now applying to four-year universities because they're not required to submit an SAT or an ACT. And continued sort of what we would call yield mitigation from universities. So schools really trying to figure out, how do we shape our class and how do we ensure that students who are applying are really going to come and enroll and essentially drive revenue for the university. And so you're continuing to see many of these schools leveraging deferrals and wait lists, and certainly a lot of the early action schools are using the wait list and deferral in big ways. Test optional, which many of you have heard about over the last couple of years, is here to stay. That's not going to go anywhere. It is very much beneficial for universities. It is generally not a great tool for our clients, for our students. And just kind of an interesting statistics that we pulled just internally, 98% of ESM students who applied this past year, 98% submitted a test score. If that's an accurate reflection of the cross-section of the types of students applying to most of the selective universities, that gives us a pretty good indication that the vast majority of competitive applicants who are applying are finding a way to test, are testing, and are submitting their test scores. And then I think, again, no surprise to you folks, we are seeing higher admissions rates for students who are applying early decision, early action, and putting their best foot forward earlier in the process. Again, that means the applicant has to be qualified and prepared and able to apply early. But generally, we are seeing more favorable results for students who put their best foot forward and get in the door early. So before we talk about this past fall, let me just sort of set the context from last year. So these are numbers from the class of 21. So you could see the number of applicants filling admissions office in terms of students looking for freshman admissions. In most of these cases, as I said earlier, we saw schools increasing their applicant pool by 10 to 15%. We don't have the full data yet because we have not got that information from the universities from the regular round. We anticipate having that sometime in April and May, and we'll update you accordingly. But this gives you an indication of these were where the numbers were last year, and in almost all cases, we're seeing that those numbers this year are higher. Again, this gives you a perspective of where we were last fall in terms of application acceptance rates at what we would call non-selective universities. So these are great schools, but these aren't sort of the elite of the elite. So it gives you a perspective that still in the United States with 3,000 four-year universities, there's really good schools that have healthy admissions rates. These are very doable for lots of kids, and they're great universities. This gives you a perspective of the acceptance rates of slightly more competitive schools, and some of the larger, more public universities like the University of Texas, University of Michigan, which are very, popular destinations for our students. It gives you a little bit of an indication here where they were last year. And this shows you, essentially where the admit rates were at the selective universities. And, in almost all cases, you're seeing these numbers either hold or become more competitive this past year. And again, we don't have all of the schools reporting just yet from the early round, and certainly not from the regular round, but the information that we are gathering from the university suggests that, getting into a tier one selective university, again, continues to be incredibly competitive. So let's look at this year. So in the early round at Johns Hopkins, they admitted 21%. At Rice, they admitted 22%. And at Boston College, they admitted 27%. Those are really solid results, given how competitive those three universities are. Johns Hopkins, one of the best pre-med schools in the country. Rice, similarly, one of the top STEM-related schools, and Boston College, really regarded as one of the top Jesuit universities throughout the United States. Anytime you're sort of north of 20% acceptance rate, that's a healthy acceptance rate for a very selective university. So the students that applied early decision this year to Johns Hopkins, to Rice, to Boston College, we're in a good position to either get admitted or deferred and waited to the regular round. At Harvard, at Duke, and Notre Dame, you saw that again, very competitive in their respective early rounds. But again, if you look at, for example, a Duke, accepting 21% of their early decision students this year, that is more favorable than what we expect their regular decision to be, which, if I had to venture a guess, I think Duke will be in the 7 to 8% acceptance rate when we get the numbers in May. So, again, looking at these schools, you're seeing very competitive schools. You're seeing very attractive universities. You're really in a great position if you're qualified to put your best foot forward. Again, this sort of mirrors, what we continue to see. When you look at schools like Emory, which is a very popular destination in Atlanta, Brown, one of the most competitive Ivies, and Penn, just again, as an example, Penn, 16% of the early decision applicant was admitted. My guess is that come regular decision, that number is going to be closer to, really 5 to 6%. And I think you're going to see a similar number at Brown. Now, I want to just pause just briefly there on the early decision numbers, because there is sometimes a misconception that folks will say, well, Billy, maybe applying early decision is helpful, but what about athletes and legacy? Isn't the deck sort of stacked against certain applicants? And the reality is that in every early decision, or in a lot of cases, early action rounds, there are going to be legacy students. There are going to be recruited student athletes. There's going to be university priorities. And you can't really help that. That's just part of the process. Even with those students accounted for, you are going to see a significantly better admissions rate for students who apply early decision. When you go into the regular round, you're going to see sometimes 5, 7, 8x times the number of applicants, not just from your school, but across the applicant pool in general. And that makes it very difficult, even for a very qualified kid. And so what we see in the regular round is, you might apply to 12 or 13 or 14 really great schools and be very, very qualified, but you may only get offers from 4 to 5 of those. And it's simply just because, the numbers are so daunting, and there are only certain amount of kids are going to get admitted. So the end result is, as it relates to early decision, even though there are athletes accounted for that, even though there are legacy kids accounted for that, if a particular school is your son or daughter's number one choice, and that is where they want to be, and they are qualified, applying early decision is essential nowadays. There's good news though. I think a lot of times we're focused on the admissions rates of early decision and generally of these universities. And we don't focus enough on the percent of the class that is filled in a particular round. In the last couple of years, we've seen the fill percentages reach 50, 55%. And even in some cases, like last year we saw at WashU, I think it was 61% of the freshman class was taken in early decision. The good news is we haven't seen that aggressiveness from the universities in this initial round. There's certainly instances, certainly like Penn, took 51% of their class in the early round. Dartmouth 46%, but Duke only took 26%. Emory only took 38%. Barnard only took 40%. So there's still a significant amount of seats available, for the students who are applying regular. Brown only took 35%. That's a significant decrease in last year. And I think really what we're seeing there is the schools just being ultra selective with who they are taking in that early decision round. And also because they're receiving more applications, they're able to keep a more competitive admit rate, but still admit enough students that they feel comfortable that they will essentially make their budget once they enroll their regular kids. I would just point out, on an Emory, that number reflects the students that they admitted in early decision 1, which was due November 1st. They notified everybody by the end of December. And so at this point, Emory has filled 38% of their freshman class. But Emory also offers early decision 2. And from what we have heard is they've seen a significant uptick in the number of students who applied to Emory this year, early decision 2. And so it is likely that by mid-February, when Emory releases early decision 2 notifications, that they may have filled 50% of the class. So 50% will be then available for the regular decision applicants who applied on January 1st, but won't hear back until the end of April. So, you just have to sort of keep in mind as we get some more of the data in, from the universities, how many more of these universities are going to ED2 options as a way of sort of locking in an additional percentage of their class before they go to the regular class and then offer those. So just something to keep in mind there. But this is good news, right? If all of these were 50, 55, 60%, that then becomes more concerning in the regular round. So the universities have, I don't want to call it pause. Again, this is only 8 schools. We're still collecting more data. We'll see what the greater trend is. But it does seem that the universities have realized that they can't, really just admit 60% of their freshman class in early decision. It makes things very difficult for the regular applicants. And at least here, this is really good news. So let's talk about the University of California system. For those of you interested, we have seen incredible growth from the UC over the last several years, in particular, the last 2 years. So in 2020, you see the number represented in gray. In the 21 class, you see represented in blue. The UC will report its 22 class at the end of this month, early February. But sort of just initial tallies and talking to folks at the various admissions offices, you're probably going to see UCLA be around 165,000 applicants, the most applied to school again in the world. And you're going to see that consistent, that consistent sort of 10 to 15 to 20% growth, across most of the UC system. We anticipate Riverside and Merced will continue to lag, but you're seeing, again, just sort of through conversations with admissions officers, incredible growth at UC Santa Cruz, at UC Davis, and UC San Diego and Santa Barbara, continuing to be very desirable locations for not only California-based students, but from students from Oregon, Texas, Nevada, and as far as New York and international students too. The UC really is a destination. And there's a few reasons for the significant growth that we're anticipating at the UC system. One is the fact that they are test blind. And, I just sort of asterisk that because, I think the UC is really trying to figure out its policy here, and like most government, bureaucracies, they are stuck in the mud, and they of course told everybody, hey, we're not going to look at test scores as part of your application process. But then on the application this year, they said, if you want to submit your test score, we will look at it for placement purposes. Really confusing messaging to students. Are they looking at the score? Should I submit the score? Should I not submit the score? But because they are test blind, not requiring test scores, not allowing test scores to be sent, you're seeing a significant uptick in the number of students who would normally pursue a community college or CSU from California, also applying to the UC. So lots of students flooding the system. In not all cases are those students qualified, but really because of fee waivers, because of no testing requirement, there's really not a downside for the application. Again, this sort of goes to my original point. There is nothing but upside for these universities who are manipulating the testing system, because they are essentially getting more applications, being able to reject more students, lowering their admit rates, becoming more selective, and seeing their rankings go up as a result. So it's all really beneficial. And of course, then the other main reason why we're continuing to see such strong growth at the UC is, despite a number of years of consistent tuition increase and fee increase, attending a UC is still about half the price in any given school year, half the price of a private school. And so, lots of families find that desirable. I'd rather spend $125,000 for 4 years of university, versus 250 or 275, or in even some cases 300. So we continue to see the UC as being an incredibly competitive, diverse applicant pool, and one that is going to be very difficult. Obviously, we share with our families in California that sometimes the best way to get into the UC is to move to Nevada. And obviously for our out-of-state clients, you've seen the benefits of being able to apply to the UC system from out of state and get admission. So we don't anticipate that trend changing this year. And our feeling is that generally the UC will continue to see growth as long as fees stay well below private school. So I just want to take a moment, sort of recalibrating on the data and saying, okay, well, what do you do now, and sort of how do you think about your list if you're a junior? And really, I think the process is, really sitting down and thinking through, 3 buckets. And, a lot of times we refer to these buckets as reach or target or safety. But, another way of thinking about this is, bucket number 1 being early decision. Are there schools that we would, as a family, consider early decision, locking our son or daughter into a binding contract? If I get in, that's where I'm going. Great. Let's make a list of all the early decision schools that could potentially make sense, and then consider the one that we would apply to. The second group is this bucket that I've sort of started to refer to as the why nots. These are solid universities that offer early action, which is non-binding. And the thought process is like, what's the downside in applying? Like, why not apply to Michigan? Why not apply to Wisconsin? Why not apply to Santa Clara? Like, why not? There's really no downside for most applicants. And then the third bucket is really, thinking through what are all the other school options that might be available to my son or daughter if the early decision or early action schools, don't pan out. And generally, we're seeing across the board kids applying now, somewhere between 18 and 25 schools. That is a lot. But it is not sort of atypical. And we think that will continue for the foreseeable future. So you may look at your son or daughter's list and say, gosh, this is a lot of schools. Billy, what are you thinking? And the reality is, for students who are not admitted early decision, we simply want to make sure we give them options. Again, sort of just recalibrating for many of you, and many of you have been through this process before, but just sort of understanding the vernacular. Regular decision, generally due January 1st. You'll find out by April 1st. Early decision, generally due November 1st. You will find sometime in December. Restrictive early action, which is only offered at really 4 universities in the United States: Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale. Again, November 1st to mid-December. early decision two, which we referenced earlier, which is becoming more of a significant piece of this puzzle. More and more schools offering early decision two, more and more students taking advantage of that. And it's very simple why. Students would much rather have this decision process for themselves done in mid-February versus waiting to the end of April. And so, early decision becoming a more common practice among students looking for top schools. And then early action is non-binding. Again, you submit November 1st, and generally we will see those applications come back with a decision in mid-December. But as we've seen, the universities once again sort of using COVID as an excuse to delay and drag out the process. We've seen Michigan and Wisconsin and the University of Texas and Virginia and lots of other schools now all say, hey, we're not going to notify you until the end of January. And so that makes it more difficult to plan and really to assess where students are. So universities not really helping our students on that regard, because, for example, if you knew in mid-December, hey, I got admitted to the University of Michigan, that might alter the list of schools that you submit on January 1st. But now that that decision is being pushed out, again, sort of all under the guise of COVID, it makes it a little bit harder to plan, and it's making students apply to more schools than maybe they normally would. I just want to touch finally on some of these application components. Again, those of you who have tuned into previous updates have heard sort of our touch points on this, but I want to just sort of speak specifically, what we saw in early decision. And so, as it relates to courses and grades, if you are applying early decision from, school XYZ in the Bay Area or in Las Vegas or in New York, you really are competing against the other early decision applicants to that university from your school. And so if your grades are not better, you are at a significant disadvantage. There's just really no way to sugarcoat that. And I think kids need to understand that, and there needs to be transparency around that. Now, one kid might say, well, listen, my GPA is lower because I took more competitive classes. There's some validity to that. But at the end of the day, if the students are in roughly the same classes at the same high school, and one student has a higher GPA at the end of 3 years, we saw in this round that generally the students with the higher GPA were the students who were getting admitted. Now, there may be the question around, well, did the student do additional work outside of high school curriculum, community college, UC Berkeley Extension, Laurel Springs, BYU, places like that? And we are seeing that that's also advantageous, right? Students boosting up their college transcript, their high school transcript. And so, when applicable, that can be really beneficial. But generally, when you're competing against kids in the same round, the grades are something that the universities are really focused on now, because, again, in some cases, not all students have test scores to compare. The essays, I think the essays were important before, and they are absolutely essential now. And it's not so much, do you have to tell like this flowery story about how great you are and, this life journey? Listen, I think that's part of it. I think it's part about being authentic and telling your story and what you've learned. Sure, that's really helpful. But I think what's become even more important are the school-specific supplement questions, which are really asking, like, why are you applying to our school? Like, what is it about Emory that is a good fit? What is it about Tulane that is a good fit? What is it about University of Richmond that is a good fit? And so I think what we saw is the students who were able to do additional research on their own, visit those campuses, speak to students who are attending those schools, read the FISC guide, really went above and beyond and try to, figure out why a particular school or a particular program was a great fit, tended to write what we thought were stronger essays for those supplements. Letters of recommendation, again, have been important in the past, continue to be important. We're even seeing in some limited experiences where the UCs are even asking now for 2 letters of recommendation. It's sort of on a random ask list. It's not something that can just be done for any applicant, but it tells me that colleges are continuing to put value in the recommendations. And even when you see large public institutions, wanting to see those letters of recommendation. That's a great sign. So again, making sure our students are thoughtful in the approach about who they ask, and really what is that particular teacher going to share, really important. Extracurricular activities, I think I have this discussion every day with one of you or families across the world. It doesn't have to be I'm president of the class, or I started my own club, or I cured cancer. Really, it's really about connecting what I like to do with the universities that I'm applying to. And you don't need to be in 10 activities or 10 clubs. Really, 3 to 4 activities where kids are able to spend some quality time and be involved over a longer period of time. That's been our advice prior to COVID. That has been our advice during COVID. And that, I think, will continue to be our advice as we move forward. We don't need a long laundry list of activities that just sort of like, hey, look what I'm involved in, but don't have any leadership. So I think what we want to continue to encourage our kids as we think through the spring semester and into summer is focus on the quality of the experience, not the number of experiences, and really continue to have that continuity throughout. And I think that's what colleges are really looking for, because they're asking more essays specifically about extracurricular activities. And so that's an important sort of pivot for the universities. They're not asking a question specific about their university. They're now turning the table on the second or third question and saying, great, you told us why we're a good fit for you, but let us understand one of the activities that you listed on the resume, and we want to get to know that a little bit better. Interviews, a lot of questions about interviews. Listen, they're great. They're helpful from a student perspective, with the opportunity to ask questions and engage with someone from the university. They very rarely move the needle in admissions. We're seeing more opportunities for interviews because now everybody's accustomed to doing Zoom, and you don't have to necessarily travel to do somewhere, and it's easier for them to leverage their alumni base. Rule of thumb is if you get an opportunity to interview, you should, and you should take the experience for what it's worth. It's good for all of our young people to have that one-on-one experience with an adult, to talk about their interests, to talk about a particular university. But I wouldn't sort of try to parse that too much and say, oh gosh, so-and-so got an interview at MIT and so-and-so didn't. And so the person who did get the interview request, has a better chance of getting in. And in a lot of cases, it's random. In a lot of cases, it's based on the availability of their alumni base. And so I wouldn't read too much into interviews. They're a great experience. They're positive. It is what it is, but I wouldn't sort of get too hyped up on it. And the last piece here is demonstrated interest. People are always like, well, how can we demonstrate interest, to a particular university? And the answer has been and continues to be very simple. Apply early. Apply early action, apply early decision. You can't do that for every school, obviously. And so for the schools that you're not able to, writing to the admissions officers when appropriate, visiting the campus when appropriate, doing the virtual tour, virtually everybody can do that, is really, really helpful, just so that the college can sort of, and the admissions readers can say, okay, this kid did not apply early action or early decision. We understand the context of why they didn't do that. That maybe they needed to raise their test scores or increase their grades, or they hadn't made a decision where they wanted to apply. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. But hey, this is a kid who did the virtual tour, signed up for our newsletter, and dropped an email, to the admissions rep who was visiting their school on a particular day. So, demonstrated interest, again, the strongest and best foot forward is really applying early. In cases where that's not possible, there are plenty of ways to continue to show interest. And it doesn't necessarily mean, visiting the campus and doing an official tour. A lot of these schools are cutting back on their tours. They're not offering the same amount of tours, and it's becoming difficult to get those. A lot of folks are doing, self-guided tours or meeting with family or friends or former ESM students on campus. All of those are positive and can be helpful. So again, thanks so much for, spending part of your morning with us and your day. We'll continue to keep you all posted. We'll be continuing to do our research on the data around the admissions process and plan to offer, another update sometime in mid-April. In the meantime, if there's anything we can ever do, please feel free to reach out. We look forward to seeing everybody. Have a great weekend and stay healthy. Bye-bye.